Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for the latest episode of Missions Talk. I'm Mike Falkenstein here again with my co-host Steve Shermer, and we have a guest, Jeff Ward from Watermark Community Church in Dallas. And Jeff, we are so glad that you're with us.
Man, I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. So you are the Director of External Focus, which I think in kind of Watermark terms is kind of the missions director, right? Do you want to give us just kind of a quick introduction to you and how you got into this, and give us kind of the 2 or 3 minute little introduction?
Sure, you bet. Well, thanks again for letting me be here. So I grew up in the church ministry family, and so I had the blessing of coming to faith early in my childhood. Lots of a foundation of Bible memory, things like that, but not a lot of discipleship, I would say, and it was easy for me to sort of drift into a feeling that the Christian walk was a lot about the don'ts, kind of avoid the big sins. And it was really many years later when I began to be discipled and learn how to read my Bible, and other guys around me going, the Christian walk is a lot about the do's, and how are you doing in that walk? And so went to school, never ever thought I would work for the church, but some course correction in theology and actually international mission trip experience, which was super helpful for me. And then sort of white knuckling vocation. I was practicing law for about 14 years or so, and then just opened up my heart to be faithful in some other way. And then a phone call came, and from Watermark here to help come on board and put some direction and strategy around some things. And so here I am 15 years later.
Not great. That's great just to see how God directed you through the whole thing, isn't it?
Yes.
That's great. Well, good. Well, Jeff, we're so excited to talk to you about, kind of something around kind of churches thinking strategically about missions. And so for what Steve and I do, of course, we see kind of all different church models, and, obviously because we have these, biblical commands from Jesus himself to go make disciples and go proclaim the gospel and to the whole creation. And, we want to kind of be thinking about, okay, how can we best do that? And so, as you guys at Watermark think about missions, kind of what are the key kind of biblical things that you kind of pull from, and how that influences kind of what you do?
Yeah, that's great. So, man, you referenced the Great Commission, Matthew 28, and we start there. We don't have to create a vision, for the church, because God's given it to us. The question is just, how do we go about accomplishing that in ways that are effective? And so one place that we start here, at Watermark, I remember even at a little talk I gave, I came out, wearing an African shirt that some friends had given me over in the Congo. And I came out and I said, when we think about missions, I think it's really easy for us, in the church to think in terms of over there, right? Like that's something we do if we go to Africa, or something we do if we go, to Latin America or somewhere. And so, and yet what we do know is the great invitation, right? Ephesians 2:10 is that that God has prepared good works for us to do, to walk in them. And so what does it look like to be on mission here and now? And so one of the things we say is that life is a long-term mission trip. Every day is a short-term mission opportunity. And so how are we on mission here and now? It's not something we do when we go overseas. It's not something we do when we're empty nesters. It's not even something we do when we serve up here, on a weekend and at the church. It's something that is just part of who we are.
That's great. And, Steve, I know you and I have talked a lot about kind of this idea that many Christians have that, for those of us like us who are kind of the professionals, that this Great Commission whole business is for us, but not for those just in the congregation. You've talked a lot about that, haven't you?
Yes, actually, I was thinking this morning in a Bible study. Were you talking to me or talking to
Yeah,
Jeff?
no, I was talking to you.
Oh,
Definitely.
oh, okay. I was thinking in a Bible study this morning that, um, how do I say this nicely? I feel like that people in the marketplace have less pressure on them in fulfilling the Great Commission than people in ministry do. Okay, in ministry, there's pressure. It's like a job, whether you view it as that or not, or a calling. There's tasks and responsibilities associated with it, and so there's pressure in the ministry side of it. But when you look at people outside of that context, and they're doing it not for as a full-time vocation, but they're doing it as part of just who they are, there's less pressure. And I was processing in my mind, like, how do you get more people in the pews to get out of the pews, to be able to think, to be able to get engaged? Because, all the professional missionaries, ministers, pastors, whatever that we can send out, no matter how many people we deploy from our churches from the West to the rest, is never going to accomplish the task. It's never going to get the gospel everywhere. And it really does demand a holistic approach of getting those people in the pews out of those seats and into the communities that they're already walking around in, and
Right.
to open their mouth and to, as Jeff was saying before we were recording, making disciples. So, that's a critical piece of the puzzle that needs to be. I know a lot of people are working on it, but it needs, maybe a stronger effort, or I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but
Oh, right.
definitely need to get more people out of the pews. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Jeff, that brings up an interesting question for you, because, certainly in my ministry, I talk a lot about the commands of Jesus, right? Jesus gives us these commands, of which I mentioned a couple: go proclaim the gospel, go make disciples. And then we have this, John 14, which Jesus says, whoever has my commands and obeys them, he it is that loves me. And so at Watermark, how are you guys trying to get people kind of engaged in some way? Because I've often talked about, well, not all of us are called to go overseas. I mean, you've got neighbors who need Christ, right? And that can be kind of your missions field if you do that well. Or we've talked a lot about, internationals who now are in our cities. And how are you guys going, hey, this Great Commission business, this is for all of us, and we want to help you engage? Is that something you guys are always, I assume it's something you guys are always talking about?
Yes, we are. And, honestly, to Steve's point, when you think about the Great Commission, right, as two parts, I mean, it was given to individuals and it was given to the church, right? And so if you're talking to me on a church staff and my role, I think all the time just about Ephesians 4:11 and 12 and how to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Right. So just breaking down that sacred secular divide, and also that, vocational ministers, clergy, if you will, are the ones that are doing ministry. Like we're trying to break down that idea all the time. And so to your question, Mike, I think I was mentioning to you earlier, whether or not you're ever called to go with us to Uganda or to Turkey or to El Salvador or Haiti or some of the places that we work, we know that you're called to be on mission right where God has you. So in your neighborhood, in your context, and a lot of times we'll talk about just dropping a pebble in a pond, right? And the ripples from that, and we'll say, the first ripple, whether you ever get to, the Acts, 1:8, this Samaria or the ends of the earth, right? How are we doing right here in Jerusalem? And that starts in your neighborhood. And so, if your neighborhood is like mine, if you live here, particularly in the Metroplex, I'd say probably 1/3 of my neighborhood are Indian, Pakistani people groups. Another third are largely Asian, Korean. And so truly, and not jokingly, I tell people sometimes the most missional thing you can do in your neighborhood is walk your dog, and get to know your neighbors and build relationships right where God has you.
That's great. Yeah. So that's great. And that's important. The thing that reminds me of, Jeff, which you probably know, I'm finding a lot of these missionary sending agencies are asking potential candidates who have said, yeah, we feel called to XYZ country, they'll first ask, what are you doing right where you live, right? This idea that there's nothing about a plane trip and a move that's going to make you effective, that if you're not effective where you already live, you're certainly not going to be effective once you deal with different cultures and languages and whatnot. So in that area, is there some training you guys have at Watermark that helps people, hey, do this well first in your neighborhood?
Yeah, for sure. So, a quick story to kind of set up an answer to that question is, growing up in my church context, we like to talk in terms of inspire and invite. And I remember growing up, many times they would put up on the screen at the church service, hey, this is the Smiths, and, they're missionaries in Argentina, and we need to be praying for them. And I remember even as a young kid being inspired by that, like, man, God's at work. He's doing something over there in Argentina, such that, our leadership would put their picture up on a screen and we'd pray for them. But I remember not feeling invited really to participate in the ministry that was happening there, beyond, sort of the giving, aspect.
Right.
And then I think sometimes the church can swing the other way, and we can kind of swing less to invitation or less to inspiration and more invitation, and go, hey, we have a dozen mission trips going this year. They're on a clipboard down in the fellowship hall. Go sign up for one. And you go look at that and you go, why is our church involved in Mexico, or why is our church involved in Latin America, or why is our church involved in some of these places that we're going? And so, we might miss the invitation piece, but we've got a real invitation to participate. And so, what we really try to do, and not always effectively, is just do both, is how to inspire people with what God is already doing around the world, and then give people just really practical handholds to participate in some of those things. And they can do that from here. They can do that in a short-term trip. They can do that in a long-term context. And so kind of looking for opportunities to do that. And so if you do, to your question, if you do raise your hand and you're like, man, I'm just exploring this, I'm inspired. I maybe have been on a short-term trip, which we really try to, we don't call those even missions trips. We call those discipleship trips, because we want people thinking about being on mission 51 weeks out of the year, and how does that additional week in a different context help you be more on mission here. So it might be a book study. We've done book studies with John Piper's book, Let the Nations Be Glad. It might be perspectives on a Christian world movement, which we host, or we collaborate with other churches and connect people for a deeper equipping opportunity. Or it might be jumping in on a Care and Connect team, with missionaries who are in the field to understand kind of the cross-cultural, what's happening, over there. So we try a number of ways to equip people wherever they are on that spectrum.
Well, that's great. That's great. And of course, we could talk a lot about this, but I do think, and Steve, you and I have talked a lot about this, that, Jeff, there's a lot of talk now, I'm sure you've heard, about the real value of these short-term mission trips, right? A lot of times the people on the ground, wherever you're going, have told people like Steve and I, man, these trips are more work than what they're worth, because they have to host all these people, and sometimes just the people on the trips don't really respect the culture just because they're new, right? They don't really know one way or the other. And Steve and I have often talked about that. Actually, it's part of whatever you say about the value of them, there is some value of, a congregation member who has never done anything like that before, never been overseas. A lot of times God really uses those type of trips to call them to a bigger something. So there's certainly, at the very least, in terms of future engagement and giving God the opportunity to really speak into their lives for what he wants to do in the future, there's really value. So Steve, I know you've kind of talked you've talked to people in a lot of your contexts about, some of these trips are a lot of work for those on the ground, aren't they?
Sometimes they're too much work. I really like Jeff, what you call them. You said you call them discipleship trips.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder why we don't all call it that. I mean, in reality, mission trips, the way they've often, at least they've become, and I've known people who actually purposely do this. It's just something you check off a box, and check the box, and when you do debrief, it's how did God impact you? Well, God just showed me how great my life was back home. And, it stops right there. I actually have a rule now that you can't say that. That cannot be an answer. You cannot tell me how blessed you are back home. There's more to what just happened here, because if you're either pouring into someone else, but I think you could say pouring in or being poured into. I mean, I think naturally we're going to be poured into when we're serving, regardless if it's in Dallas or Denver or here in South Carolina or in Turkey or wherever we're at. We're going to be poured into it as we're pouring into other people. So I think calling it a discipleship trip makes more sense, because it is developing who we are. It's the ongoing development of our walk with Christ. And, every step of that should be having some impact and causing growth in us as we progress forward. But yes, they are a lot of work. And there are churches I've had to walk away from, and not work with them anymore.
Yeah. Our friends at Chalmers have done some really great, work on that too. They When Helping Hurts, kind of principles, and they've written some great stuff around, the value of trips and how to do those well, but honestly, I mean, I'm sitting here in this role because of a short-term trip where I was able to go and see God at work in a different context, which I tell people is a little bit like getting glasses for me to come back home from that trip and to go, man, you see all the same people, the same places, the same challenges, but you just see them differently because you've seen God at work over there, and you go, man, he's working there in a certain way, but he's working here in another way. And so, yeah, you don't want to, keep sending the same teams to paint the same house, in the same village, over and over, but they can be done, thoughtfully and well.
That's great. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You don't want to just create busy work. Right. So Jeff, in terms of churches thinking strategically about missions, of course, this idea of, how to think strategically about creating partnerships domestically and internationally. There's kind of that kind of runs the full gamut, doesn't it? Because some churches might say, no, we really work with the navigators or crew. And then as they're sending people to, again, any number of countries around the world, that's kind of what works well for us. There are some churches that have their own. You even mentioned, I think, there's a church that you mentioned that they've got 20 missionaries that they directly support and have trained, and they're out on the field. And so there is kind of a gamut of what works, isn't there, in terms of creating partnerships?
Yeah, there really is. And, so I just remember when I came into this role 15 years ago, and I just, not being seminary trained, or a missiologist, I knew there was a steep learning curve. And so I literally just started picking up the phone and calling global missions pastors at every church I could find. And I'm certain that's where I got my caffeine addiction, just taking those guys to coffee, and going, what have you learned? What's your model? What's working well? What are your best practices for us? And so there really is a spectrum. And, there's a church, a great church right down the road from us that doesn't work with any real nonprofits, parachurch organizations. They say, we don't understand that world, but we know church. And so they only have church to church relationships with places overseas. Other churches, like you mentioned, they are a sending church, in the way that they define that is they take North Americans or people who are raising their hand saying, we want to go overseas. They take them through a very robust year or 2-year, institute or training, and then they fund them. They work with, They might even operate as the sending organization, or there's a handoff, to a sending organization. And then that is their primary strategy, is just working with their missionary teams or their units, in the field. And so, yeah, there's a wide spectrum. And a lot of, I think what I told you even before about this podcast is on that spectrum, I think I have a lot more questions than I have answers.
Oh, right.
But it's a lot of just thinking about the sweet spot. If you're drawing a Venn diagram for your church context, what is it that God has asked us to do? What are the challenges, the needs that we feel called to move toward? And then just how has God resourced your church?
That's great. I appreciate that little list, because I was just going to ask you kind of your advice if there were church leaders watching, how to best do that. I wonder too if sometimes it might be. I know I was in a church years ago, and we just had a guy start coming to our church who was from Ethiopia, and our church was looking for ways to be involved. And so sometimes God might bring you someone from a particular place, right? And you go,
yeah,
hey, that's a pretty simple thing. We've got someone right here who's from Ethiopia, and sometimes that happens too, doesn't it?
It sure does. And that's an interesting example, because that's an area we have not yet explored. We've kind of had the idea and stuck a pin in it. But, like here at Watermark, we've got about 60 countries represented, first generation, folks. And we systematically met with those groups kind of as people groups, and said, hey, why are you here and not in an ethnic church? Or, and how can we be a resource and equipper for you all, who do know the culture, who do know the language, who do have friends and family, back home or in those contexts. And how do we leverage that? And so, again, that's an area we're just getting going, kind of trying to explore.
That's great. And Steve, I know you've had you've seen all those different models as well, haven't you, in terms of how churches can create partnerships either domestically or internationally?
Yeah, I think I was trying to look at my notes. I liked what Jeff said about all churches finding their sweet spot, because we're not in those cookie cutter subdivisions in church planting. We're not trying to make the same house that 100 families have to live in. And but yeah, I know as time goes on, I'd be interested to know how Watermark lands on that in terms of, you said 60 countries, I think.
Yes.
Were represented in your church. It'd be interesting to know how you land on that, only because, on the flip side, in my work with places like China and the Middle East, there's a lot of times it's this mentality of, we're going to reach these people here because they're going to reach their people back home. That can happen, but in reality, a lot of people who end up coming to live here don't want to go back home. I mean, that's right. Just reality. Mm-hmm. There are some who do, and you definitely want to prepare for that, but it's not like everything else, sending out missionaries, or whether it be cross-cultural missionaries, Americans to be expats in some foreign country. There's no perfect model. So, but I do like the fact that you sat down with them. I think in a lot of cases that's not happening, just based on my observation. I'm sure there's churches out there who have done it, but I haven't seen it where you've got people in your churches from these countries. We're not sitting down and listening to them and trying to figure out, number one, what's it going to take? Number two, are they even interested? Because I've actually come across some who weren't interested in talking with their own people. But, like where I live, there's, we moved here 10 years ago, and 10 years ago, I don't think I could find one person from India in our whole city. 10 years later, they're everywhere. And I don't even know why, except they bought up all the hotels and the gas stations and the Subway restaurants, and there's now a market here just for that group of people and their food and stuff. So It's, I only know of one guy here locally that's trying to get other believers to even think about what's it going to take to reach these people.
Hmm.
And so I just love the fact that your church is doing that.
Well, it's interesting because, I went through the Perspectives on Christian World Movement class a while back, and my favorite part of that class was the history of sort of missions methodologies, through the different eras based on what was happening in culture. And it might be Roman roads and infrastructure. It might be the printing press. Now we're in a digital age. And so what does a modern day Great Commission look like? But one of the interesting parts of that conversation was migration. Migration of either forced migration, of a dispersion type, or maybe a voluntary migration. And so, certainly here in our context where we live, truly the ends of the earth are here. There's globalization, there's corporate relocation, there's an influx. We've got UTD right up the road from our church, the University of Texas at Dallas, which has around 8,500 international students. And actually is in the top, I think, 15 schools in the country in terms of the number of international students. And that's just one example, and so that group of people are being trained as influencers and leaders. And many of them will be returning to their country of origin. Many will not, but they're here right on our doorstep, and they want relationships with North Americans and with Americans. And so, we get to have conversations that we can't have in Beijing or Iran,
right,
or Northern India. And so that is happening here, as well as even just resettlement of refugees. And so the Metroplex actually resettles more refugees, I believe, than anywhere in the country. And we're seeing that. And we are going, let's double down on the ends of the earth are here. And the interesting part is a big part of our overseas strategy is partnering with indigenous church planting organizations. And what's been fun is to have the conversation with them around some of the tools that they're developing to reach and develop and train Christians in those overseas contexts. We go, that's an online resource. We could use that here in Dallas.
Oh,
and so there's kind of a reverse, leveraging of the tools that they're developing over there right here. So we've gotten modern Persian Bibles and we've brought them here. We're about to do a Christmas campaign around Southeast Asia. Some of the tools they're using, we can use, right here in our context. So that's been kind of fun.
Well, friends, thank you for tuning in to what is actually just part one of a two-part video with Jeff Ward of Watermark Community Church. I think what I appreciate the most about what they're doing at Watermark is, this idea of indigenous church planning, working with those organizations. I think there just needs to be, way more of that, right? Just kind of this general idea that, yes, North Americans, we have a lot we can contribute, but when it comes to understanding the culture, the language, other nonverbal cues of a particular culture, at the very least, having a strong partnership, kind of a 50-50, if not, hey, this is your country. We just want to use our resources, our knowledge to be able to train you to be able to do what God's called you to do, for you to reach your country is, way more of that. So thanks for tuning in. This is, as I mentioned, just part one of two parts. And so please tune in to our YouTube channel or our Facebook page to be able to get the second part of our interview, where, by the way, we're going to talk about kind of the difference between international partnerships versus partnering with kind of North American based organizations. This idea of that the nations are actually coming to us. And so probably step one should just be, let's look around our cities and see, there's actually, people from Pakistan and South America and all these, places that are sending us, their people. And maybe that's kind of the first step. So be sure to tune into that. Thank you so much for joining us for Missions Talk. We sure appreciate you all. And again, we'll look forward to seeing you on part 2 of our interview with Jeff Ward.